All right, Luke chapter 19. We're in this series looking at Jesus and these dramatic encounters that these people have with Jesus. And one of the things we said a couple of weeks ago when we looked at this encounter that he had with Nicodemus, I almost called him Nickelodeon. Isn't that weird? I don't know why. Nickelodeon almost came out of my mouth. He had this encounter with Nickelodeon. This encounter that he had with Nicodemus, we talked about how sometimes God's light shines so brightly on us, and our eyes have become so accustomed to sitting in the dark that when the light comes on, it's painful, and we wince, and we want to pull away, and we want to retreat back to darkness because it's comfortable there, and it's safe there. But what Jesus asks us to do is sit. Sit there in the light and let the light sort of wash over us. And if we'll allow the light to wash over us, gradually we'll find our eyes adjusting to the light. And then we'll be able to see things as He sees them, as they really are. And our belief is, or my belief is, that if I could see things the way He sees them, I'd be more likely to do what He says to do. Well, the truth, as we've seen, is really hard sometimes. It's difficult to face truth about yourself or about your spouse or about that person you trusted and now that person is no longer trustworthy. Maybe was never trustworthy and there were things that you didn't see initially. And sometimes you don't want to see the truth. But as hard as the truth may be, truth is absolutely necessary. You must learn to traffic in truth, especially when it comes to who God is. You really want to deal with God as He is, as He actually exists. You don't want to start dealing with God as He exists in your mind, or as you think He might exist, or as you hope He exists. You have to deal with God as He is. And you have to deal with yourself as you really are. And the problem with our own hearts is we're so prone to self-deception. But we must strip that away and deal with ourselves as we actually exist. And we must learn to deal with the world as it really is. Not some sort of Pollyanna, always perfect, blue skies and rainbows kind of life, but life in the goodness and the badness, life with all of its ups and downs. We must deal with the world as it really is and not as we wish it would exist. Now, frequently, dealing in truth involves pain, but it is no use trying to live any other way. And sometimes we want to hide, but you cannot have a dramatic encounter with Jesus unless you're willing to step into the light, because that's where Jesus lives. Jesus only lives in the truth. And until you're willing to step into the truth, you cannot have an encounter with Him. You keep hiding and you keep back there in the shadows, but you will not have a dramatic, real encounter with Jesus because He lives in the truth. In fact, He says, not only do I speak truth, I am truth. And in Revelation, this passage that I preached on this past Sunday, He says, I am the one who is holy and true. These are things He is, not simply things that He does. He speaks truth because He is truth. And so if you want to encounter Him, you must be willing to come out of hiding, out of the shadows, and come into the light of His truth. Okay, now, Luke chapter 19, we have this dramatic encounter. Beginning in verse 1. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he couldn't see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see Him, since Jesus was coming that way. And when Jesus reached the spot, He looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. Now all the people saw this and began to mutter, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I'll pay him back 4 times the amount. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save what was lost. Okay, now, let's just talk about, I want to talk about jobs. I want to talk about occupations for a little while. We'll do a show of hands on this one. When you were a little kid, how many of you, when you think back to when you were a little kid, would say, when I grow up, I want to be a policeman, fireman, nurse, something that requires the wearing of a uniform? How many of you would have said, that's what I'm going to be when I grow up? Anybody? Some of you wanted to be, that's it? No policeman, no astronaut? Anybody wanted to be an astronaut when you were a kid? There you go, right there. Okay. How many of you wanted to be something like an actor or a singer or a clown or something like that that required you being up in front of people? How many of you? Okay. How many of you actually made the clown thing? Did anybody actually become a rodeo clown or something? No? Okay. I don't know anybody who said, I want to be a rodeo clown, but I'm sure some people. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a trash man because I thought they only worked on Tuesdays. How many of you wanted to be like a doctor or a lawyer or a professional or something like that? Okay, some of you, a scientist, something like that? Okay. Professional athletes, anybody wanted to be a professional athlete? Okay. Yeah, that's a big one for kids especially. Anybody wanted to be an IRS agent? It's laughable, isn't it? I have never met anyone. I've met people that work for the IRS, and I've never heard anybody say, I'm an IRS agent because it was a dream of mine since I was a child. I've never heard anybody say just the passion of my heart to be an IRS agent. Tax collectors have never been popular. In fact, 10 years ago, 11 years ago actually, the IRS changed the title Revenue Agent. They took that away. That's no longer anybody's official title. No one is a revenue agent anymore because of so many negative connotations. Instead, they began hiring people to be compliance persons. They're not fooling anybody with that, are they? I mean, like, if the IRS calls and you say, are you a revenue agent? And they say, no, I'm a compliance person. You know it's the same thing. Nothing good can come from that. Now, in Israel, they actually had a list of occupations that were not just frowned upon, they were what were known as despised occupations. And some of these lists, rabbis would compile these lists of despised occupations. And some of those lists have still survived to this day. On one rabbi's list, physicians and butchers were despised occupations. One reason why is because they're always handling blood and guts and all that kind of stuff. But the other reason why is because they assumed that people who were butchers and physicians showed preferential treatment to wealthy people. And so that was so common in that generation that made the list of despised occupations. There was another list that included being a tanner of dead skins. Again, you can understand why that. And being, this is actually a job, being a dung collector. That was an occupation back then, and there was actually a special dispensation for women whose husbands became dung collectors. The rabbis said you could divorce your husband simply by saying he's become a dung collector, and no more questions were asked, no more even this. One rabbi said even if you knew he was going to do it before you married him, you could say, I thought I could handle it, but I cannot. And they'd let you right out. Another list, people who gamble with dice, people who are involved in usury, people who lend money, again, because they figured those people were corrupt. Being a pigeon trainer. Now, I thought, what's up with that? And I found out that pigeon racing was a very common form of gambling in the first century. And so being a pigeon trainer meant you were involved in gambling. And so that was, and at the bottom of everybody's list was always tax collector. Nobody ever has viewed this occupation in high esteem. Now you remember that Israel was occupied by Rome. They were not a free country. They were under Roman occupation. And the Romans were constantly looking for ways to squeeze money out of the countries that they occupied, because they had this huge army they had to support, and they had all those Roman roads that they had to build and all these other things. So one of the things they found out was we can actually get more money from them if we use locals. If we get natives to do it, instead of Romans coming in and demanding money, people were resentful of that, but if we use people who are Jewish, we'll get more money from them. So Jewish people would bid to become tax collectors. And they would look at an area like North Fulton County, and they would tell the Roman government, I think I can get you $100 million worth of taxes out of North Fulton County in the next year. And the Romans would say, that's higher than anybody else has bid, and so you're hired. And your job then is to get as much money as you can. And you owe the Roman government $100 million at the end of the year. But if you collect, say, $140 million, then guess what happens to that other $40 million? You get to keep that. So anything above what you said you would give to the Romans, you got to keep. So the Romans figured out this is a very efficient system because the workers are now highly motivated to get as much money as they can. And if the job goes to the highest bidder, it worked well for the Roman government and for these people who would get the job as the tax collector. Now, what that meant, though, for the rest of society is everybody else viewed this person as a traitor, as somebody who had sold them out to the Roman oppressors. They were assumed to be dishonest and guilty of other stuff. We don't exactly know what, but they're guilty of all kinds of things. And one rabbi said, repentance is hard for tax collectors. Because, and one of the things they said was that if a tax collector came to repentance, they wouldn't know where to begin making amends to people because they'd offended absolutely everyone. And so how do you even start to pay any of this stuff back? One town in a Roman province, I'm not making this up, there was a town that actually built a statue to an honest tax collector who lived among them. It was so rare that they decided on his death they would honor him. There's a statue to the honest tax collector. That's how rare and uncommon it was. Now, tax collectors were also not only sort of frowned upon by society, they were deprived of some of their social and civil rights. They were not allowed to testify in court as a witness because they were considered to be unreliable and dishonest witnesses. They were not allowed to be a judge or to be an elder in a synagogue. In fact, a really, really rigid and orthodox Jewish person would not even allow the tassels of their robe to brush up against a tax collector because they were considered to be so vile and so offensive. So for us to really get our heads around the way people viewed tax collectors in our society, we have to think so far out there. I mean, we have to think of like in the category of drug dealer or mafia hitman or the owner of an adult bookstore. That's the kind of what the emotions that those occupations tend to stir up within you are the same kinds of emotions that would be stirred up within people during Jesus' time. This person is so far outside the boundaries. Now, the question is, what would drive a person like Zacchaeus to choose an occupation like tax collector? I mean, because he wasn't forced into this role. He bid on this role. He chose it voluntarily. And what in the world would drive someone to that, knowing the repercussions that were likely to occur in your life? Well, I have an answer. It's just a theory. It's just some speculation on my part. But Zacchaeus has one physical characteristic that is prominent enough for Luke to mention it. What is the one physical characteristic that Luke mentions about him? He's a wee little man. That's what we know him as. Now you can imagine like how, to his chagrin, it would be to know that 2,000 years later people refer to him as a wee little man. But that's, and men are not supposed to be wee little men. Men are supposed to be three things. The last two are dark and handsome, right? And the first one is tall. That's what makes a man tall. And here's Zacchaeus, and he is not tall. He's a wee little man. He's the runt of the litter. And the truth is, human nature has changed very little in 2,000 years. And people can be very cruel to those who appear different. And especially children. Children and adolescents can be very, very unspeakably cruel to those who appear different from the rest of us. And you can imagine what life is like growing up as Zacchaeus. He's probably been a wee little man. He was a wee little boy. He was a wee little teenager and was probably treated differently, probably treated with disrespect. And maybe something happens in Zacchaeus where he says, I'll show them I can grow up and be powerful. And I'll wield the only kind of power I can get my hands on. If I can't get social clout, I will find a way. And he decides to go into this career. Maybe obviously he had drive and he had ambition because he's not just a tax collector, is he? He's a chief tax collector, right? That means he's got people who work under him. That means he is really, really good at what he does, which also means he's really, really bad when it comes to morality and ethics. And he's very wealthy, it says, so it's safe to say he was probably dishonest and corrupt. You know, sometimes something happens that cuts you off from community. And we saw that with the guy who had leprosy a few weeks ago. And in the last week with the man who was born blind. Sometimes something happens and it's totally out of your control and it cuts you off from community. And sometimes you make decisions, even though you knew better. You intentionally choose to cut yourself off from community. Sometimes it happens to you, and sometimes you bring it upon yourself. And some people actually think, you know what? As long as I have money and clout and power, I don't need community. And Zacchaeus seems to have bet the farm on that, but doesn't seem to have been working very well. Somehow or other, Zacchaeus hears that Jesus is coming to his town, coming to Jericho, and something in him begins to stir. There's something about Jesus that intrigues him, something about Jesus that's interesting to him. Now, I don't think you have to go too far to figure out what it is about Jesus that would have drawn someone like Zacchaeus. Flip back 12 chapters to Luke chapter 5. And we're going to see what it is, I think, that appeals to Zacchaeus about Jesus. Luke chapter 5, Jesus has just healed a guy who was paralyzed. He just healed a guy, and it kind of demonstrated that he had come from God. And then you go to verse 27, and it says, after this, after healing this guy, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting in his tax booth. Follow me, Jesus said to him, and Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. Now, three amazing things have just happened here. First, Jesus heals somebody. Heals a paralyzed guy, and that's amazing. Second, Jesus approaches a tax collector and says, follow me. That would have been amazing, because here's a guy who clearly comes from God, and now he's going to a tax collector. But then the third amazing thing is the tax collector gets up, leaves everything, and follows him. So you get these three amazing things that follow closely upon one another. And then look at verse 29. Then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his house. And Jesus said, oh, of course I couldn't go to that kind of a banquet because there are going to be sinful people there. Probably beer and things like that. Of course I couldn't do that. I have to avoid the appearance of evil after all. No, that's not what Jesus said at all. Instead, I'm sorry, are you reading this with me? Instead, a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to his disciples, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? And those two phrases, tax collectors and sinners, occur over and over again through the gospel. They're almost synonymous, tax collectors and sinners. Verse 31, Jesus answered them, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. So this amazing thing has happened. Now you go back to Luke 19, and I imagine word of something like that tends to get out, tends to spread. And this guy can heal, so he obviously comes from God, but he also hangs out with drug dealers and mafia hitmen and people who own adult bookstores. He hangs out with hookers and he hangs out with tax collectors. And in fact, one of his followers is a former tax collector. What kind of guy is that? What must he really be like? Zacchaeus realizes, I have to go see him. I must go see him. By the way, if you look up to the paragraph before Luke 19, the end of Luke 18, what do you see? You see, as Jesus approached Jericho, he heals a blind man. So he's already healed somebody. Behold the pattern that Luke has set up for us. We're going to see the exact same kind of pattern that we just saw in Luke chapter 5. Jesus heals, demonstrating he obviously came from God, and yet this man who came from God goes to the vilest, sinful people he can find, and he calls them to follow him, and sure enough, they leave everything they have behind in order to be with him, to experience the community that he offers them. So Zacchaeus goes out to see him, but there's this big crowd. And now, question, how do you suppose Zacchaeus feels about a crowd? especially a crowd that is probably a little bit stirred up at the possibility of the Messiah's appearance. The Messiah who is supposed to drive the Romans out once and for all and return Israel to its prominent state of glory. How does Zacchaeus, the one who is cooperating with the Romans, the one who has been viewed as a traitor who's sold out his brethren to the Roman oppressors, how does he feel about a crowd of people who are starting to get really riled up about this Messiah who's come? I imagine it makes him pretty nervous. So, while the text says he climbs a tree so he can see, I imagine there may be another factor at work here that propels him up that sycamore tree as well. Maybe more than just the desire to see, maybe a desire to avoid being seen drives him up into the leaves of this tree. So he gets up there. Verse 4 says, he ran ahead, climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. I think it's to see over the crowd to avoid being seen by the crowd. But you know, I want you to see, there's something in Zacchaeus, and there's something in a lot of people. We want to see Jesus, but we want to hide at the same time. We kind of want to see, but we want to see from the shadows. We want to stay hidden and not come all the way out into the open. And that's what's going on here with Zacchaeus. But the truth is, we said at the beginning, you can't have a dramatic encounter with Jesus and hide in the shadows at the same time. Verse 5. When Jesus reached the spot, imagine you're Zacchaeus and you're sitting up in your tree, okay? And Jesus is walking right at you. And as he comes towards you, you're thinking, what a great idea this was. This is so brilliant. I'm way up here. I can see, nobody else can. He's coming right over here. I'll be able to hear everything he says. This is fantastic. I am so brilliant. Look at me. And Jesus keeps getting closer and closer and closer, and you get more and more excited. And then he's touching the tree, and then he's leaning up against the tree, and then he's looking up in the tree. No, this isn't what I had in mind. Now, again, because when Jesus starts looking up in the tree, guess what everybody else does? I mean, you can imagine if you walked in here and I was standing like this. You guys, it wouldn't take long for you start looking up there, right? He's looking up there. What do you suppose he's looking up there at? Is there a cat up there or something? Is something stuck? What is he looking up? And now everybody's looking at Zacchaeus. The very thing he wanted to avoid is now happening. Not only is Jesus there, but he's looking up at you. And now everybody else is looking at me too. And Zacchaeus starts to wonder, what's going to happen now? And now Jesus clears his throat. Zacchaeus? And at just that one word, you can imagine the buzz that starts to go around that crowd. Zacchaeus? Is that Zacchaeus up there? Ooh, this is going to get good. You get him, Jesus. Zacchaeus, come down from there immediately. Yes! Get him, Jesus. Really get him good. This is going to be good. I'm so glad we came out here today. You watch this. Finally, that tax collector is going to get what's coming to him. Zacchaeus came to hide. He watched at a safe distance, and now everybody knows that he's up there. Zacchaeus, come down. It's hard to have a conversation with you up there like that. It's awkward. And then what does Jesus say? I must stay at your house today. Not, I want to stay at your house. Not, I'd like to stay at your house. Not even, I'm going to stay at your house. I must. There's something that Jesus is trying to communicate here with that choice of words. I must. This is what I have come to do. This is not a sideline for me. This is the thing. This isn't a distraction from my mission. This is my mission. I came for this purpose, and my purpose will not be fulfilled. My destiny will not be complete until I do this, until I stay at your house. Jesus, don't you know who he is? Yes, this is why I came. Don't you know what he's done? Yes, he doesn't deserve it. That's the point. Jesus comes to offer acceptance to people who are unacceptable, to offer grace to people who don't deserve it, and forgiveness to people who have messed up intentionally. See, it's one thing for us to say, well, of course he would reach out to the leper, because that poor leper didn't do anything to deserve that. That man was born blind. It wasn't him. It wasn't his parents. Nicodemus was a good-hearted man who was just a little confused about things. But Zacchaeus, he chose this. He knew what was going to happen. He knew that this was the wrong thing to do, and he did it anyway. He doesn't deserve it, Jesus. And Jesus says, this is why I came. And by the way, this is what we must do as well, as those who claim to be followers of Jesus. Jesus says, I must do this, and so must we. Jesus must offer community and fellowship to those on the outside, even those who have done it on purpose. Jesus says, I must, and so must we. We must go and find those whose lives are in shambles through no fault of their own, and we must go and find those who are confused and misguided about who God is and what He is like, and we must go and find those whose lives are in a shambles because they chose to do wrong even though they knew better. Because Jesus said He must, you and I must as well. We must find those who chose to do wrong even though they knew better. Now, let me say a word, and this is where we're going to spend the rest of our time tonight, to Zacchaeus. Because I know he's here. He may be a man and he may be a woman. But I know in a group this size, look, in a group this size, there are people who are hiding. People who live with the constant fear that one day they will be exposed. And I want to say, I want you to notice a couple of things here about this encounter that Jesus has with Zacchaeus. First of all, I want you to notice that Jesus doesn't send somebody up there to get him. Jesus doesn't say, hey, Peter, John, go up there and get him, make him come down. Neither does Jesus climb up there himself. I will come, don't make me come up there. The choice is Zacchaeus. He gets to choose whether he comes down or not. Jesus offers the invitation to people who are close and to people who are far, to people who do not deserve it and never would deserve it, never could deserve it. Jesus offers the invitation, but it's up to you to decide. You choose. Zacchaeus could have said, could have stayed up there clutching that branch. That was his choice to make. So that's the first thing. I want you to know that if you're going to have an encounter with Jesus, if you're going to participate in the grand work of redemption and build community by building intimacy with God, first you have to choose to come out of hiding. And there are people in this room. I don't know who you are, but you know who you are. There are people in this room, and you've been hiding. And the invitation is offered to you tonight. Will you come out of hiding? Will you come down from there? I see you up there anyway. Jesus, so often, God, throughout all of the biblical record, comes to people with these questions. Adam, where are you? He knows where Adam is. What's he asking? I see you over there. Will you come out of hiding? Zacchaeus, come down from there, would you? Come down. Come out of hiding. Come out of the shadows. The first step of restoration is always, will you come out of hiding? People just amaze me with how dumb we can be. With how we think we're hiding and think we can get away with things. There's actually a website that I visited this afternoon called dumbcriminals.com. Have you guys ever heard of this website? It's just a catalog of the most ridiculous criminal activities imaginable. These were just 4 that I pulled off the website today. In Indianapolis, Indiana, last week, a guy tried to hold up a KFC. And he ordered a bucket of chicken and then said, give me all the cash in the register or I'll shoot you. And he reached into the pocket of his jacket and pointed something at the person behind the cash register. And said it loudly enough so that everybody else in the restaurant heard. But while he's facing the cashier, a guy from in the restaurant stands up, walks over, and points a 9mm at the back of his head and says, "We're going to stand right here until the police get here. I've just called them on my cell phone." What's he thinking? And then come to find out it's a screwdriver in his pocket anyway. In Kuala Lumpur, 3 guys were trying to rob a bank, and they had a big truck, and they pulled up to a bank of ATMs and put a rope around one of the machines and pulled it, yanked it all the way down the street. It's dragging sparks everywhere. The police chased them because they're dragging this big, giant, heavy machine behind their truck. Police end up catching them. Turns out it's not a cash machine, it's a check deposit machine. There's a bunch of uncashed checks in this machine. That's what they robbed. Royal Oak, Michigan, a guy robbed a 7-Eleven and then ran out of gas 3/4 of a mile down the road. It's a 7-Eleven, they sell gas! Fill up first! A guy in California stole a bunch of people's ATM cards and credit cards and had their code numbers and everything. So he's going to go to ATMs, he's going to try to get money out, but he knew that there were cameras in those ATMs, and so he wanted to disguise himself. So he put on a clown suit. He's got a big clown suit, clown makeup, clown everything, going to the ATM trying to get money out. But now they're just putting out an APB on a guy in a clown suit. How hard is that to spot? You know, and this is the pattern. This is why I bring this up. Because sin, there's a theologian named Alvin Plantinga. He's actually a philosopher and a theologian, PhD, brilliant guy. And he wrote a book about sin. And the first line is, sin is stupid. You got to get a PhD to learn that, I guess. Sin is stupid. Sin leads us to do dumb things. Sin, in the long run, you know what it always leads to? It always leads to hiding. Wrongdoing leads to hiding. I feel guilty. I feel shame. And so my first instinct is to hide, to pretend like nothing is really wrong. And hiding ultimately leads to being alone, to aloneness. And some of you know what that feels like. You did wrong. You felt guilty. You withdrew. You went into hiding. And then you felt so all alone. And maybe you were able to fool some people and get some people to be kind to you. But deep down inside, you had this haunting, nagging feeling that if they only really knew, if they really knew what you were really like, they would not be kind to you and they would not love you. Wrongdoing always leads to hiding, and it leads to aloneness. It leads to brokenness. It leads to no community and no intimacy. And that burden gets so heavy that eventually people are willing to do ridiculous things to try to unburden themselves. There's another website, and I talk about this in one of the books that I have out in October. There's another website called notproud.com. And they started it in the year 2000. And it's totally anonymous. You go on this website and you just confess whatever you've done wrong. And they have their confessions organized by the 7 deadly sins and miscellaneous. And I'm telling you, it is not for the faint of heart, because the confessions that are made on there will absolutely break you if you have any measure of compassion at all. What drives somebody to go to a website and type in their deepest, darkest secret? That burden gets so heavy. And people, human beings, are not designed to carry the weight of guilt and shame and aloneness. And so here's a place that offers people the ability to come clean and tell the truth about themselves without fear of rejection. There's no rejection. It's all anonymous. There's no judgment being passed there. And I think there's a positive to that, and there's a negative to that. And I wish that churches had the reputation of being the kind of place where you could come and be honest and come clean about who you really are in your deepest, darkest times. And at churches, we're not viewed as places where you would come and receive judgment and rejection for what you had done, but we're places of grace and acceptance and healing. But unfortunately, our reputation is not that. Now, the negative side to this, I think, is that this website offers people the ability to come clean without fear of rejection, but it also gives them a false sense that they've done the work. But the work hasn't been done until you're ready to face the consequences of your actions. They want to tell the truth about themselves, but they don't want to really come out of hiding. And until you come out of hiding, you can't really do the work of restoration and healing. Now imagine you're Zacchaeus. For some of you, it's not hard to do. Imagine you're sitting up in that tree, and there's half of you that really hopes he looks up there. And there's another half of you that is really, really afraid he's going to look up there. And he finally does look up there, and he's looking right at you, and now everybody in the crowd is looking right at you. And he says, Zacchaeus, come down. Now, what is it inside of you right now that you're really afraid he's going to want to talk to you about? For a lot of you, something has bubbled up to the surface already. For some of you, it's a name. For some of you, it's a date. For some of you, it's a location. For some of you, there's an image that's sort of floated up to the video monitor in your brain right now. What is the one thing you hope beyond all hope? Please, Jesus, don't mention that. We can talk about this. Let's talk about work. Can we talk about work? Let's talk about work. Just not that. Let's talk about this other thing. Let's talk about my finances, please. And you know that you're desperate when you're ready to talk about your finances with him. Let's talk about my finances, but let's not talk about this. Not this. What is that one thing? Would you be willing tonight to come out of hiding on that one thing? And you may need to find somebody that you can talk to. Another human being that you can confess to. Certainly you need to talk to Jesus about. But would you be willing tonight to say, okay, if I'm going to have a dramatic encounter with Jesus, I must come clean about everything. Some of you are involved in 12-step programs. And you know one of the steps reads this way: we admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. We faced the truth about ourselves ruthlessly, and we stopped hiding. See, a lot of the power that sin has over your life comes as a result not of the sin itself, but of hiding the sin. And once you come clean about it, you'd be amazed at how much freedom you find just from that simple act of confession. Zacchaeus has to come out of hiding, and then he has to be willing to face the truth to Jesus, to himself, and now to this crowd of people who are gathered around him that he's wronged. And part of our brokenness is this ability that we have to live with these enormous problems as long as nobody else notices. As long as nobody else finds out about them, I'm okay. I can limp along, I can figure this out, I can solve this problem, I can deal with it, I can handle it, I can live with it as long as nobody else finds out about it. And the truth about us is we're all sinners. And the truth about a lot of us is we're much more concerned with getting caught than we are with getting help. Jesus doesn't say, clean up your act and then I'll come. Jesus says, come down. I must go to your house today. Jesus always leads with acceptance. Always leads with grace. Because he knows grace can do things that guilt never could. And maybe, as those who claim to be followers of Jesus, that ought to be the approach we take when we find people who have just fallen and they can't get up. Maybe if we led with grace and acceptance, we would find that that would accomplish far more than shame and guilt ever could. Come down. I must go to your house today. Verse 7. What's the first word of verse 7? All. Not some, not a few, not a couple, not 5% of the negative minority, but all the people saw this and began to mutter, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. And when that starts to happen, Zacchaeus realizes something about himself. You know what? My lifestyle does not match up here. My lifestyle is not reflective of one who is a companion of Jesus. And that apparently is what I am now. And so, more than anything, I want to remove whatever is in my life that's keeping me from experiencing intimacy with Jesus. I don't clean this stuff out so that I can get a relationship with Jesus. I clean this stuff out because I have a relationship with Jesus, you see? First things first. Before Jesus comes, Zacchaeus is willing to give up everything so he can be wealthy. He's willing to give up relationships. He's willing to give up his reputation. He's willing to give up his standing in society so that he can be wealthy. And now he's willing to give up absolutely everything so that he can experience intimacy with Jesus. So he stands up, look what he says in verse 8. He makes two promises. Read the last half of verse 8 first, then we'll go back to the first half. He says, Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I'll pay back 4 times the amount. Now this is just ridiculous. First of all, you want to say, dude, how much money did you steal? You know, but you got, legally, he's obligated to pay people back what he stole plus 20%. That's legally what he's obligated to do. He's paying them back 4 times as much. That's quite a return on investment. I'd let him steal from me if that was, how I knew where it was going to end up. He says, so that's what he's going to do, but he doesn't just do that. Not only am I willing to make amends, but look what he says at the first half. Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. Not only am I going to pay people back, I'm going to stop stealing, but this is what could be called remove and replace. There are kind of 3 steps he goes through. First, come out of hiding. Second, examine yourself ruthlessly. Third, remove and replace. You remove the sin, which for him was apparently greed, but it's not enough to just stop doing that. You have to then start doing something else. You have to replace it with something else. So you remove the sin and you replace it with what is the opposite virtue of this sinful practice. For him, the opposite of greed is generosity. So I'm going to start being generous with my money. Paul says, put aside falsehood and begin living in truthfulness, or truthiness, for those of you who are Colbert Report people, right? Truthiness. Okay, the Bible says, replace bitterness with forgiveness. Replace pride with service. Replace greed with generosity. If you find yourself prone to a particular sin and you really want to stop doing it, the best way to do it is to start doing the opposite. If you find yourself, if you're just a chronic, negative, complaining kind of person, you can find something to complain about in everything. Here's what you need to do. You need to find people on a consistent basis that you can encourage. If you find yourself complaining about stuff, you need to find something you can be thankful for. If you find yourself gossiping about other people, you need to figure out ways you can praise people. Find what is the sin that it really, really has its handle on me, and what's the opposite of that, and start practicing that. That's what Zacchaeus does here. He removes the sin and he replaces it with somebody else. And you know you've been gripped by the kingdom of God when you reach the point that Zacchaeus has reached. Because basically what he's saying is it's not about doing the math and what exactly is 4 times this with interest and you calculate inflation, all that kind of stuff. That's not what he's thinking about. You know what he's saying? Really? Whatever it takes. Whatever I have to do. Whatever I've got to do to remove the stuff that stands between me and an intimate connection with Jesus, I'm ready to do it. I don't care what it is. What do I have to do? Do I need to quit my job? Do I need to move out of that apartment? Do I need to break up with that person? Do I need to find somewhere else to live? Do I need to get a different house? What do I need to do? What is it that's standing between me and intimacy with God, and I'm ready? I will do whatever it takes to ruthlessly tear this out of my life. When you get to that point, that's when you know you're gripped by the kingdom of God. And until you're ready to do that, you're still hiding back in the shadows. And you're trying to spin things, and you're trying to do damage control, and you haven't really been gripped by the grace and acceptance that Jesus offers. Verse 9. Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to his house, because this man too is the son of Abraham." Now I want you to notice Zacchaeus hasn't even done all the stuff yet. But Jesus says, "Today salvation has come to this house. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost." Salvation has come to this house. I must stay at your house today. See, wherever Jesus shows up, that's where salvation is. Zacchaeus' life was an absolute waste. Was an absolute dreadful mess. But you know what about Zacchaeus I love? He's one dramatic encounter away from being consumed by the grace of God. And the truth is, in a group this large, there's some of you. You've been hiding. I mean, you may look great on the outside, and you may have a nice job, and you may live in a nice house, and you may have lots of people who are willing to do whatever it is you tell them to do, but you know deep down inside, my life is a mess. And I've made terrible, terrible choices. And John, you don't know how long it's been, or how far I've gone, or what all I've done. And you're right, I don't. But you do, and Jesus does, and it doesn't matter, because you are one decision away from being totally consumed by the grace of God. Jesus stands and says, "Will you come down from there?" And he leaves it up to you to decide. Let's stand and we'll pray. God, your grace knows no boundaries, and you stand as a faithful Father, ready to receive His wayward sons and daughters who have gone to the distant land. And so many of us have been gone for so long, and we feel so alone because our sin has produced guilt inside of us, and that guilt has caused us to go into hiding, and that hiding has produced this aloneness and this brokenness and this lack of community. And you call to us tonight, and some of us are ready to step out of hiding. And I pray that you will make us brave. And Father, I pray for this church that we will be a community that leads with grace and acceptance. Not that lets people off the hook, that allows people to tell the truth about themselves without having to face the consequences of their actions, but that we will be a place of true grace and healing and restoration. That we would help people do the hard work that you call us to do. Thank you so much for Zacchaeus and for this dramatic encounter. But more than anything, we thank you for Jesus, and we pray in His name. Amen. We'll see you next week.